Today on Better Book Clubs, tips for reading George Orwell's 1984. I'm doing this video on 1984 because it was the winner the last time I did a poll asking you what you'd like a video on. And so this novel was the winner. The funny thing is, I thought I had read 1984 before, and when I went back to reread it in order to make this video, I realized I had never read it before. So if I hadn't misremembered, I wouldn't have even put it on the poll, but it was. So I'm going to follow through and tell you about 1984 and give you some tips for reading it. But full disclosure, I didn't really enjoy reading this novel, and I'm going to tell you a little bit later why. But let me talk a little bit first about the book itself and about George Orwell, the author. So George Orwell was an English writer, although he was born in India, and he spent part of his adult life there as well. That experience actually informed some of his essays. He's actually just as well known as an essayist as he is a novelist. But if you're not familiar with his essays, you've still probably heard of his novels. 1984 was published in 1949, but his novel Animal Farm is also pretty famous and often taught in school, and Animal Farm came first. That was published in 1945. George Orwell also fought in the Spanish Civil War, and he was a war correspondent during World War II. In fact, he reported for the BBC for a couple of years during World War II. So he was also a journalist. So he had quite a breadth of experience as a writer, and I will say I've enjoyed some of his essays in the past. So when I say I didn't really enjoy reading 1984, that's not to say that I don't think George Orwell is a good writer. So the thing that stood out most to me in reading this novel was that we often misappropriate it in our cultural conversations today. You've probably heard the adjective Orwellian. That's thrown around a lot of times without a real acknowledgement of what George Orwell actually was writing and thinking about and concerned about. You also hear the term Big Brother used a lot, and that comes from this book. The way we use it in our culture today, when you hear people talking about Big Brother, they're often talking about like being spied on by big tech and by corporations and by security cameras. And while that plays a role in this novel, it's not really what Big Brother is about. And I had that same misconception going in. I was expecting that I was reading science fiction, and in a way it is. It's speculative fiction because it was written, as I said, in 1949, but it takes place in 1984. So it is science fiction-y, but really I would say that at its heart, it's more political commentary than anything else. And if you've ever read Animal Farm, you'll see that there are lots of similarities in the political concerns that Orwell has in both of these novels. So that was something that surprised me and that also threw me off in the beginning as I was starting to read the book. I had to kind of adjust my expectations of what I thought the book was going to be about. And in hindsight, I think I was conflating it with Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. I think that's the book that I read probably way back in high school that I was mistaking for 1984. So before I get to my tips for reading 1984, I want to mention some of the things that I disliked about this novel. I don't know that I would say that the way our culture talks about it, the disconnect between that and what the novel's really doing was really something I disliked. It was more something surprising that threw me off. But there were some things about the novel that I actively disliked. One of them was that Orwell really, I felt, needed a better editor. He's a great essayist, but the novel was just too slow to get started. And in particular, what was happening was he was spending a lot of time in the beginning of the novel doing world building because it's speculative fiction. So he's got to kind of teach you and introduce you to the world he's created in order for you to inhabit it. But he does that at the expense of plot and characterization. So it took a really long time, I felt, to get to the part where I felt like I was actually reading a novel, where something was happening to people, to characters, as opposed to reading some kind of a treatise or somebody's notes on a world that they wanted to create. Another thing that I kind of disliked, which is not Orwell's fault, is that it's really weird to read a novel that's set in the future when the future is in your past. Reading it in 2023, of course, we're way beyond 1984 now, and it's not so much that Orwell got things wrong about 1984. I don't think anybody really ever expects a speculative novel to hit all the marks. And in fact, one thing that was really interesting was that he anticipated some things about the way our society works today, including, I would say, social media. There's this thing called the 2-minute hate that everybody has to sit down and expose themselves to, and it felt a lot like how people talk about being exposed to Twitter. But the weird thing about it is that the novel also reads as very old-fashioned. It reads like a novel of the 40s, not like a novel of the 80s. And so that there was another disconnect for me there that I kind of disliked as a reader. But the thing that bothered me the most was the misogyny in this novel, the messed up ideas about sex, particularly sexual relations between men and women, and also the anti-Semitism. There's a lot of that, and it's really hard to get through. That makes it really difficult to accept some of the other things that are being said in the book. It really gets in the way, or at least it did for me. So that was probably the thing I disliked the most about reading this novel. For that reason, I don't think this novel should be taught in high school anymore. I know that it is still taught, but it doesn't feel appropriate to me for high school students. And it's also depressing. The worldview is depressing, and so I remember having this on my nightstand for a while during the pandemic and thinking, I just don't have it in me to read this right now. And I was right. I think it would have been really difficult. It's a pretty dark worldview. I'm not saying that I don't want to read books with a darker worldview. I think it's important to ask some of these big questions about our political system and our society. But I wouldn't recommend it if you're going through a time like that in your own life experience. So let's get to some tips for reading 1984. If you've kind of cleared those hurdles and you're like, yes, I want to read it, if for no other reason than to be able to enter into the cultural conversation in which 1984 is still brought up, then let's talk about some tips for reading it successfully. So my first piece of advice would be not to get too caught up in trying to draw parallels between what Orwell is saying in 1984 and what's happening in American society today or English society today. I mean, I saw some parallels in, for example, the groupthink that's happening and the way people are willing to just accept a complete revisionist idea of the facts. It's hard to, I think I would have had a hard time imagining that certain facts could actually become up for grabs if I had read this 10 years ago, but now I get it. So, you know, there are some ways in which I saw some interesting parallels, and I'm sure you'll see some as you're reading it too. But on the other hand, trying to draw those parallels as you're reading can be quite distracting, especially because the book is also doing some things completely different and of its own, and you want to be able to appreciate it for its own merits and its own ideas and not be trying to fit them into a box. It's also helpful to think about the novel as being part of its own time and place. So I would say that one of the things I noticed at times was that it's a very classist story in a way that American stories tend not to be. It was very English, in other words. There were times when I just thought, oh yeah, we wouldn't say that in America. And so remembering that it was written in a particular time and place is also helpful. There's a section of the novel where the main character, Winston, is sharing the text of a political screed, a book written by another character named Goldstein. I would say that unless you're writing a paper about 1984, you should feel free to briskly skim that entire part of the novel. I mean, when I talk about it needing to be edited, that is one of the prime problems with this novel in my mind, is that you end up being asked to read this entire political discourse written by somebody else in the book, and it's a lot. It's a lot to ask of a reader, and I didn't really feel that it enriched my experience of the novel very much, honestly. So my advice would be, feel free to skim that. I didn't say skip it, but I won't tell anybody if you do. I would also say that there's something else going on in this novel that doesn't get talked about, that's kind of like not part of the social conversation about it, and that is the fact that Orwell is very concerned about language, which is not surprising because he's a writer. There's this kind of sterilization and compression of language happening called newspeak, where they're trying to get rid of old words, kind of retire them and simplify the language. And that's an interesting concern that he has. You could argue that that's happening in our culture, but I'm not sure. I also feel like humans jump in and make new words all the time when they need them. So newspeak, one interesting thing about it is that there's an appendix to the novel in which he talks about this some more. The appendix says that newspeak is supposed to be completely adopted by 2050. So this is kind of an interesting twist here, because now we are 2023 readers still in the speculative part of the story, because 2050 hasn't come yet, even though 1984 has. That kind of gave me an opportunity as a reader to feel as if I was still inside the fiction a little bit, whereas if you're going to read it with an eye towards 1984, you're kind of thrown outside the fiction by being a reader after that time. But I think it's interesting to pay attention to what Orwell is saying about language, because it's obviously an important concern of his, and it's also not something that people usually talk about when they talk about 1984. My last tip is actually a little reading recommendation, a piece written by an English teacher named Rachel Klein for Electric Literature, the journal Electric Literature, called Please Stop Comparing Things to 1984. She has a different reason for saying she doesn't want to teach the book anymore to high school students than I mentioned, which is that I felt that the gender roles and the sexuality that's normalized in this novel is really weird and probably not appropriate at the high school level. But she has a political reason for not teaching it any longer, even though she taught it for many years. So I'll link to that piece below in case you're interested in following up on that, because she has another interesting perspective to share. That's it for my tips on reading George Orwell's 1984. I'd be really interested to hear if you've read it, if you'd enjoyed the novel, if you feel like I've missed something because I'm not such a big fan of it. But let me know in the comment section below, because I always love to hear from you. As always, if you like what you see here, please subscribe, and I'll be back soon with another episode of Better Book Clubs.